The partition of India in 1947 led to the largest forced migration in human history, with an estimated 10 to 12 million people becoming displaced. And that was accompanied with widespread violence, which also sadly led to an approximation of 1 to 2 million people losing their lives. And 77 years on, we're still seeing some of the ramifications. And somebody who has written on this extensively is award winning author and journalist Anam Zakaria. She has published 3 books. These are The Footprints of Partition, Narratives of 4 Generations of Pakistanis and Indians, and her second book, The Great Divide, A Journey into Pakistan Administered Kashmir. Both of those were published by HarperCollins. And her most recent book, 1971, A People's History from Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India. And that is published by Penguin Random House. And I'm Dr. Serena Hussain. I'm an Associate Professor of Sociology at the Centre for Peace and Security at Coventry University. Of course, we met a few years ago in person, and you very kindly gave me your book, The Great Divide. And I remember reading it back then. And what really struck me is just how powerful some of those narratives were. You could really get a sense of the emotion, understand why your work has been so well received. And of course, for your first book, you won the KLF German Peace Prize. But I wanted to ask you what motivated you to spend so much time working on this topic and, of course, speaking to so many people and collecting oral history.
So this work, really, I think the partition book and then subsequently the Kashmir work in the 1971 has been a very organic journey for me. None of these kind of emerged from an academic project. I had actually just done my undergrad and I had moved back to Pakistan from Canada, and I ended up joining the Citizens Archive of Pakistan, which is a local nonprofit dedicated to historic and cultural preservation. I say really by chance I landed into this position, and it was in many ways so transformative for me because CAP at that point was just kind of in its early years, and it was really trying to set up its oral history work in Lahore. And they brought me on board for that, and I was very new to oral histories. I very much learned on the job, and my work became about going out and meeting partition survivors and speaking with them and documenting their stories. And there were so many extraordinary stories among the most ordinary and mundane everyday realities of people's lives, and we wanted to kind of understand that better. So here I was sitting with people who had lived through that time, and they were telling me a far more nuanced um, of that past of 1947, of the subsequent years, and of the years before. I personally have had the privilege of interviewing somebody as old as 112, who
Mm.
remembered British colonization, the independence movement, the birth of Pakistan, and so on. So that really is what kind of got me interested in partition. And I, of course, come from Punjab, so I have, like many other families, a partition story of my own, but one that I don't think I fully understood or took that kind of interest in till I began to do this work. My grandmother, on my maternal side, was in her 20s, and she was very active involved in volunteer work. She volunteered at one of the largest refugee camps in Lahore, Walton, at that time. So I did grow up hearing those stories, but when I began doing this work and I kind of went back to her and I started documenting my own family story as well, I came across so many other narratives that had been lost over generations, that had not really been talked about. Stories of her Hindu and Sikh friends. She used to live in a model town which was a Hindu dominated area. So I just realized the richness that lies in oral histories and in these stories that too often we try to neatly package,
Mm.
in textbooks, in museums, and how are people's personal stories kind of appropriated sometimes and weaponized and instrumentalized for national agendas, right? But how those personal stories can offer resistance and sometimes the only kind of unsilencing and puncturing and punctuation of state and official histories as well. So that's kind of how I got into this work on partition. And I think the other aspect that was really important for me was, with the Citizens Archive, I was running another project for them, which was called Exchange for Change. And I really connected school children in India and Pakistan. So I had I guess really the privilege of being able to cross the border, which is so hard in South Asia. I was able to go across, I was able to take students across, welcome students from India as well. And this was really, a transformational journey for me, because my family on my father's side also comes from Batala, so I have history and
Mm.
heritage on that side. So doing this work with children on one hand, and then with elders on the other, was really showed me the gaps. And showed me the urgency of also documenting these stories, because my concern has been, and I think that gets more and more real as time goes on, that when we lose those who remember a more nuanced past, we will only be left with those jingoistic packaged histories. So that's a long answer as to kind of what motivated me and what got me on this journey. But I will just say, after I finished writing this book, it was very much focused on Punjab. I think a lot of work on
Mhm.
partition is focused on Punjab. I mean, that's where I come from. That's a region that saw so much of that violence. So it tends to dominate. But I began to realize that, realizing that histories are more complex, and they're not homogenous. So depending on which region you're in, what your caste is, what your class was, what your gender was, the realities were so different. And I really began to, understand and realize that I had to look beyond Punjab.
I was curious as you were speaking, you got a chance to cross over to the other side. How were you perceived on the other side? Because of course you collected oral history on both, which is, I think, what makes your work so powerful. But did you feel that your identity as somebody who was coming from Pakistan had an impact? If not for the sort of the duration of you doing that work, but perhaps initially when you were contacting people to take those accounts?
I think my identity absolutely had an impact. I think my identity had a greater impact in Kashmir and Bangladesh. The reason I say this is because when I was doing this work in India, I was often there, either for literature festival, or I was there because I was running these exchange programs. So, and I met people through those projects that I was working on, and so they very much knew I was Pakistani. I think people often connected to my identity as a Lahori more, because a lot
Mm,
of people had family histories. So, the minute I said I'm from Lahore, people wanted to know what Mall Road looked like or what GC College looked
mm,
like. And so that was a point of connection, especially in Delhi. I think it also varied as I kind of traveled within India a little bit. I went to Mumbai. This is obviously post 2008. So being Pakistani there becomes more and more loaded, right? So I had, not necessarily with people, but just generally, in terms of having reporting visas and, interactions at the airport with officials. And so those kinds of things absolutely play in. When I used to go to schools, I've always had really interesting encounters. Like often people, children won't know where I'm from, and I often don't tell them initially. I kind of have them guess, because I'm really curious. And Pakistan never comes up, right, as an option, because there's a certain image of what Pakistanis are supposed to look like, how they dress, how they and so forth. And I've written about this one anecdote in my book. This is in Mumbai. This little child came up to me because I was wearing this visitor kind of tag and said, visitor, where are you from? And eventually I said Pakistan. And he ran away from me. He said, I'm scared of Ajmal Kasab. Right. So I think those notions of Pakistan equals terrorist and fundamentalist can be easy tropes to fall into, and that is often what children particularly learn. But I think it does vary on, like, in terms of who I'm speaking to, where I'm at. In Delhi, I've had very different encounters as well, and I know friends who've had more hostile encounters than I've had. I think because I went in through these programs, a lot of times it was a softer kind of entry. But yeah, my Pakistani identity is something, of course, is very, very present. But sometimes my Punjabi identity or my Lahori identity becomes more pronounced because people can connect to that a little bit more. So that's always really interesting. But I can talk more about this when I get to the other books. I think it was much more loaded in some ways in those other spaces. Yeah.
yeah, that is really interesting. Yeah, let's talk about the second book. I suppose one of the things, when I was thinking about your work, that differentiates the books, and I'm sure there are many other characteristics that differ in those experiences, is the fact that the line of control that divides what was the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir is still a live conflict zone, in the sense that there is, fairly frequent cross-border shelling and ceasefire violations. What was that like for you? I mean, did you consider that in terms of, were you hesitant to visit those areas? But also, did it change, in your opinion, the kinds of narratives? Because I suppose with the others, they were sort of retrospective or thinking about how, what has happened in the past was impacting them currently. But I suppose this is really still ongoing and an ongoing consideration for the people that you were to.
That's a really, really great question. It's something I've thought about a lot. And it's something I kind of realized once I started doing this work that it's very different, right? Because it's so ongoing. The trauma, the violence, is the instability, the volatility of it. When I first began doing my research, it was back in 2014. Which was a relatively quieter period on this side of the line of control where I was. So when I went in, I was particularly working in Neelam Valley, and I was
Mm,
interviewing, women and children over there. And then I worked a lot in the refugee camps in Manakpayan, where like a lot of people who had flee persecution from the Indian military in the late 80s and early 90s were kind of settled. So I was doing these interviews, and especially for the women, um, it was at that point a moment where there was relative peace in Elam Valley. So what they felt was very important for me to know as a Pakistani who lived literally, I was in Islamabad at this point, so just a few hours away, was that they had lived through about 14, 15-year period of war, right? Where there was intense mortar shelling. Many of those women had lost family members. One of the women who hosted me in this conversation in her house had lost her son. So it was very recent, but it was also a moment in which they were able to reflect back and tell me what had happened and what I did not know as a Pakistani, right? Which was so close to my home, but I was really unaware. But during the course of doing this research, 2016 happened. Burhan Wani was killed.
mm,
India and Pakistan relations, took a extreme downturn, became very, very hostile. And as things become hostile between these two nations, what we always see is that people on the line of control face the brunt of it. So in many ways, that moment, that temporary moment of what looked like potentially relative peace, I don't even know if you can call it that, right, was completely undone. And so when I went back and I was continuing to research and write this book, it didn't come out until 2018. Many of the women who had shown me their bunkers that they used to seek refuge in before told me that they were back in those bunkers. There were moments where, even if you heard a certain sound, like it would worry me. But more than me, because I get to leave, I have those layers of privilege really that comes with telling somebody's story and it not being my story. I think what it meant for children who have grown up there, and those who have inherited these stories and memories as well, is that every time there's a loud sound, it could be something like like a firecracker at a wedding, but they immediately their mind goes to it's a bombing, it's shelling,
mhm,
right? And so that trauma is just it's very visceral. It's very much there. So it was very different than doing the work on partition. There's so much volatility because it can happen, the next minute. There's something about how do you continue with the everyday amidst that chaos. Even by the way, when I was working in Neelam Valley and there was these moments of relative peace where shelling was not actively happening in this region, there were other parts that continued to face it. Kotli, Nakyal, these
mm,
other regions. So I think that's also really important to remember that in places where there's ongoing settler colonialism and there's ongoing colonization and militarization and weaponization, right? You will always, even in moments of what seem like peace, or when Kashmir recedes from mainstream news, people
mm.
are always living through that vulnerability and volatility and violence, to different degrees in different areas. And there's always danger of what can happen and when will it happen, not even if it will happen.
And I'm just wondering, of course, there are people who crossed over from the other side and then settled in Pakistan administered Jammu and Kashmir, what we of course refer to as Azad Kashmir. What were their experiences once they'd sort of migrated and then were now essentially unable to leave and return. I'm just wondering because I've heard myself, varying accounts of what that has been like. And I suppose what one of the things that differentiates the line of control, or what we call the LOC, of course, is that it's not an international border, and there was actually, you know, some movement back and forth for quite some time, on and off, and then that stopped, of course, and then people sort of became stuck.
Absolutely. So I think it also varied because some people eventually moved to out of Kashmir and into mainstream cities. So you have people in Lahore, Islamabad, Karachi, and trying to rebuild their life in the ways that they can, finding work and so forth. So I did do some interviews with them as well, but some of the interviews I did were with people who are still living in these quote unquote refugee camps where infrastructure is really, really poor. And I think that for a lot of them, like you said, when they first had to flee and when they came to the side, they did not realize that this was something that was going to mean that they would be stuck or they would not be able to go back, right? A lot of them moved in the early 90s, and the movement for Azadi in that at that time was very heightened, and there was a lot of hope as
Mm,
well that Kashmir would be free. So a lot of them held on to that hope and continue to hold on to that hope in many ways, right? But of course, it's becoming harder and harder. They now have children. They're, adults who have literally grown up in these camps. This is the only life that they know on this side of Kashmir. So it's very complicated. Many of them are still have divided families. They told me that prior to social media and prior to kind of cell phones and Skype and WhatsApp and all of that. Sometimes when there were moments of relative peace, they would actually sit by the Neelam River because it
mm,
shrinks, especially in the winter months, and they would try to talk to each other across the river. And some of that has been replaced with modern technology, but of course, internet gets shut down all the time in Indian-held Kashmir, right? So then that
God.
communication is also disrupted abruptly, or yeah, just people are prevented from connecting. So there are all of those kinds of stories. There are stories of people who had been tortured by the Indian military, and they still bear those marks and those scars that they carry with them. I also think that sometimes there can be tension between the local population and those who move because sometimes like in any region, like politics can vary and differ, right? So for the women, for instance, that are living right on the line of control, they say to me, all we want is aman, right?
Mm.
Because we face the consequences of whenever there's tension. But for a lot of people who see their home as on the other side, like there is no option but azadi. Right? That is something that is very personal. It has to happen for them because that's the only way they get to reunite. So you know, yeah, you kind of see those dimensions as well.
And then, of course, we've recently had a conflict between India and Pakistan. I'll come on to that actually. I think I want to speak about your third book first. So, this book, of course, includes Bangladesh. So, we have narratives from the division that happened, or the separation, perhaps we could call it more appropriately, that happened in 1971. Again, more recent, perhaps more raw in the sense that more people had sort of lived through that, so they have lived memory of that happening. And of course, you traveled there to take those accounts to conduct this research in oral history. So again, this is a third location. How was that for you as somebody who is doing research again on partition, but within a different, I suppose you can say, historical timeline and region?
So I think there are some points of connection in all of these books, but I think, each project, each region, each kind of violence is also very unique, right? And I think I came to 71 through Kashmir in some ways, because when I was in Kashmir, I began to realize that you cannot really understand current politics and policies in the region if we don't understand what happened in 1971. So that was the moment of curiosity, and I decided to do this project because I felt like compared to partition of 1947, when it comes to 1971, we know so little as Pakistanis. And it continues to define regional relationships and dynamics. And how is it that we know so little? And what had happened for me was that when I was working with the Citizens Archive, focusing on partition, they had done this project called The State of Being So Divided, which actually commemorated the 40th year of the birth of Bangladesh. And so I had conducted some interviews, and most of these were with folks who were in the military at that time. But within those narratives, which often reinforced kind of the limited understanding I had of this time period. When we were post in East Pakistan, you could see the economic deprivation, or the terminologies that we used to refer to Bengalis were extremely derogatory. These are the words we used. And so those things had stayed with me, and I knew there was a lot more to unpack. I thought about doing this book, and I started to realize also that when I was looking at partition, in when you think about these meta macro events, sometimes we think that no matter which angle you look at them from, they are the same because quote unquote they're objective histories. But what I had found was that India has a very different interpretation, at least back then, of partition than Pakistan did. Because for Pakistan, partition was very much linked to nation making. So there was the
Mm.
sense of triumph, and there was the sense that the bloodshed and the violence was also maybe a sacrifice in the process of nation making. It was couched in those narratives, a martyrdom, right? But in
Yeah.
India, a lot of times when I went there, people would say, we wish Pakistan had never been created. And there was a sense of like a more palatable, more accessible nostalgia and longing, and also the sense of breakup of the motherland. And I think look at that from people's perspective in terms of nostalgia and loss and longing, but states often co-opt that, and India has co-opted that as like Muslim treachery. And that
Mm.
has real consequences for the Muslim community there, where you constantly have to prove your loyalty, right? But, anyways, I was kind of looking at these two different narratives of partition. I began to think also more deeply about 71 and how Pakistan, yes, it frames it as another partition. We use terms like dismemberment, Sakut-e Dhaka, the fall of East Pakistan. But in Bangladesh, the terminology frequently uses liberation, right? It is nation making.
Mm.
So that's what I also mean by like these histories are also so different when you kind of go deeper, right? And I decided to do this project because I was curious about how does Bangladesh remember what Pakistan has chosen to forget? How does memory and forgetting and remembering and forgetting kind of work, and how do they shape each other as well? Because I think these nations are in conversation with each other many times. So what was really fascinating for me was that Bangladesh has had its own history after 1971. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who's considered a founding figure, was killed, and it's in the 90s that you see a lot of like people's movements to restore and recover and document the history and the violence. And at the same time, you have this publication of multiple military memoirs in Pakistan trying to kind of come up with their narrative of 71, which I really saw as like trying to, like they're almost in conversation or responding to what's happening in Bangladesh at this time. So I'm really curious about the relationship between state histories and then the relationship between state histories and personal histories. So I looked at state memory. I went to museums in Bangladesh. I looked at museums in Pakistan and how which histories are present, which ones are absent, terminologies that are used. I think it's fascinating that in the Pakistan Military Museum, we use the term genocide, which Bangladesh
Oh.
has been asking for, but we use it for pro Pakistanis, largely the Urdu speaking community or West Pakistanis were living there. We also use the term Indian state sponsored terrorism, which I see as a response to how India frames everything that happens in Kashmir as Pakistan state sponsored terrorism. Because
Mm.
when you evoke the term terrorism, you depoliticize any movement, right? Whether that's for Palestinians or Kashmiris or, then East Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Bengalis, right? So I looked at this state history, and then I looked at people's memories and how they were telling different stories. So a lot of times, of course, the memory of people in Bangladesh was so different from the memories that I was documenting in Pakistan. And they really felt like it was their duty to tell me because for a lot of them, I was the first Pakistani they were meeting. So it was like, you need to know what happened because, when it comes to 1971, it is not just the violence of 1971, but it is also the violence of erasure. There's this sense of obligation and this need. to continue telling that history so we don't forget. So there was that. But I also found that within these countries, you found resistance narratives as well. So yeah, I found in Pakistan, in Punjab, that there was a very small but movement by intellectuals and human rights activists and journalists, and sometimes even people in the military who resisted military violence.
And as you said, it's difficult. It's a very difficult sort of conversation to have in Pakistan, of course, for obvious reasons. So being there and sort of having to confront that head on, how was that again? I mean, I can see what you said that it sounds that people were really grateful that you were willing to actually listen to what they had to say as somebody from Pakistan. Um, but for you coming back away from that, I mean, did it change your perception of the Pakistani state narrative around that, or was it sort of in line actually with what you were expecting to find?
That's a great question. So I spoke about my Punjabi identity kind of forming connection in India, but my Punjabi identity in Bangladesh was very loaded because it's the Punjabi, like ethnicity that tends to dominate the military, and that was also the face of domination, occupation, and violence in Bangladesh. So sometimes, I mean, yes, there were people who wanted to talk to me and wanted to tell me their story. I don't know if honestly if they were grateful. I think it was more like there was also anger, and they wanted to be heard, right? But then for others, they didn't want to talk to me. This book is very much a book about what does it mean to tell that history almost 50 years on to a Pakistani.
Mm.
If somebody else did this book, very different stories would emerge. So my positionality, my identity is shapes this book, shapes the questions, shapes the answers, shapes every interaction. I think this was one of the most important works that I've done on a personal level because it's a very violent history. It was psychologically very difficult for me to document these stories. Sometimes the places I was living in had been used as torture
Gosh.
chambers, right? So there were moments where I would wake up and I was going to a lot of museums, and I was hearing so many stories where I couldn't sleep. I would hear those sounds. When I came back, it really took a toll on my mental health. I had a lot of insomnia. I had a lot of intrusive thoughts. It was very difficult, but it's so important for me to understand that, and I think kind of undo some of that silencing that exists. Going there and actually meeting with people and being in those spaces and hearing those stories was something else. I think I particularly learned more about the Urdu speaking community because they are
Mm.
often used in Pakistan as to earn compassion for Pakistan's cause. Hundreds of members of the Urdu-speaking community who had been left in Bangladesh and were not owned by Pakistan, and they were stateless until 2008 and continue to face a lot of challenges over there. So I learned more about that. I learned so much more about how defining 71 was in shaping Pakistan's nuclear policies and education policies, and how the martial race theory was kind of deployed, this very racial, eugenics kind of ideology. So I learned that there's an art to this that states use, and I see India use in Kashmir, I see Israel use, I see Pakistan having used and continue to use for so many populations currently that continue to be oppressed. So there were a lot of learnings from this work.
Again, just thinking about people who do research on these kinds of topics where we're asking people or we're trying to learn about that lived experience through violence and conflict. How does one, as a researcher, deal with that trauma themselves? Because, of course, you are hearing these accounts and you kind of mention that. Um, I mean, I just wondered if you had some kind of strategy or a way that you were able to process that after, essentially collecting these very painful accounts.
I wish I did. I don't know if I do. I think it's very difficult work, and I want to speak about my process. I also want to just touch upon the ethics of doing this work as well, because I know that a lot of people are interested in oral history, and I love that. I also realize that I've had to do a lot of my learning over the years. There when I was early on in my career, when I first started doing this work, I wanted to be the one who was uncovering every story or telling every untold narrative. I think I realized the problem with pushing people to tell trauma stories over time. And the Bangladesh book, I had a lot of difficulty getting to Bangladesh, visa issues that I did not imagine, kind of were there. And I could spend a very limited time. So I chose to speak to people who wanted to speak to me. And that
Mm.
means that I could not tell certain stories that I want to, or I was not able to access them. So I think there's also that, especially when you're doing it in places where your positionality is very loaded, like, pushing somebody to tell a Pakistani story, and then I go, what does that mean? So I thought a lot about those things, and but then in terms of the stories that I did document, I'll be honest, it there's a visceral and there's a vicarious impact on researchers, on storytellers, and this book in particular was very difficult
Mm.
because of the silencing as well. It's also because of course I have friends and I have fellow scholars who know these issues who I can speak to, but for a long time I did not, like, when I had questions or when I ran, like, when I was concerned, I didn't know who to speak to, and I've over time kind of built some relationships that are deeply meaningful. There are other things like writing that helps me, writing around what I'm doing. It's also finding ways to not disconnect, because I don't know if you can ever do that, but finding lighter things. So I think all of that. But for me personally, and this is not for everybody, I ended up actually doing training in counseling. I realized that um, there is there are the ethics of doing this work, and there's a very active listening piece to doing this work, and there's an element of respecting silence and working with embodied ways of telling trauma, because some histories are unsayable and maybe they're not meant to be said, to me at least at this point in time. And how do I kind of understand that? So I went and I did training, and I'm now licensing in psychotherapy in Canada as well. And that really is something that is, no matter how busy life gets, is something I don't kind of give up on, because I think that's a really important place for me to kind of understand how these stories impact me, create space for myself, and be able to go back and do this work as well. So I don't know if I have a one answer, but I think it's all of those things that over time I've had to learn to do.
It's just one of those topics that's difficult for anybody who is impacted by it in any way. So yeah, I kind of just really wanted to congratulate you again on your work because it's so important, and I mean it's incredible the fact that you've got 3 books on this. Really, I think just makes it such a critical resource for that period and beyond. And I think moving on to beyond and moving on to the present day, we're 77 years on since partition. With India and Pakistan, it's sort of cyclical. So whether we have the highs and we have the lows, and we'll ever get to a place where people accept this is now the reality, and we'll find a way to, I don't want to say coexist because of course we are coexisting, but to find a way to develop more empathy with those histories that they've kind of then had to go through simultaneously but separately. And then when they do merge, they seem to merge in conflict rather than in collaboration or peace. But I know it's a difficult question. But yeah, I just wanted your thoughts on that.
There is so much that is difficult in our past that has not been come to terms with at all. So there are all these uncomfortable histories that we don't want to even touch upon, right? So I feel like we haven't even done that work. We haven't even begun to do that work where we're able to own these histories, contemporary realities, the violence, and the otherization. I also think that what we saw in the recent conflict was, I feel like both states at the state level got what they wanted, right? This jingoism feeds into especially India's electoral politics right
Mm.
now. Right. We also saw, and surveys are showing that a deep appreciation of the Pakistan military right now. And so I feel like because the past is then weaponized and instrumentalized for national agendas, um, I, I worry about the impact of that. I am somebody who's worked on a lot of peace building initiatives. I know other people who are doing incredibly amazing work. I see the power of that dialogue. I see the power of these kinds of dialogues. I see the power of social media and technology and connection. And I've seen what happens when children speak to each other, when they're able to cross over, when they have a 30-minute conversation. I think there's all of that. I do think though that we have to be realistic that state machineries have a lot more outreach, unfortunately. And I also am hesitant that people can remain insulated from that at all times. So I know that sometimes we say, at the people level, there's a lot of love, and I think that's partially true. I also think that sometimes, that can be a little naive because there's a lot of hatred that seeps in. There's a lot of animosity. I mean, you just have to turn towards social media and the conversations, whether that's because people have genuine fear in terms of what they can say or cannot say, or whether those are real sentiments, I don't know. But it is scary, right? The warmongering is scary. Um, the way in which we understand patriotism and nationalism is scary. The way we ask people to constantly prove their loyalty to the nation state is scary. Who we consider a patriotic citizen is scary because all of that is premised on this otherization. So I don't see us being able to undo that till states stop appropriating and using that. So I know that's not a very happy note to end on, but I have to be honest. I'm worried. Yeah, and I also think the other piece about this is that yes, there was a de-escalation, and thank goodness. But what was happening in Kashmir prior to that, and what continues to happen in the line of control, tends to get overshadowed. So yes, things may end for like, ostensibly in the major bigger cities, and we may feel like, oh, this is like it's done. There might be another cycle of this, but is it really done? In Kashmir, I don't know. I don't think so. No. So I think that's also important to keep in mind that even when we feel like we are over it, we're usually not. Not for certain communities, not for certain regions and people, particularly, especially Kashmir.